This is Raul Lopez, and you're listening to How Do You Say Success in Spanglish? The path to success isn't easy. For minorities and people of color, many attempt this journey with little to no guidance. Join me as I sit down with individuals who share their stories of perseverance so that together we can learn how to say success in Spanglish. What's good, mi gente? Welcome back, and thank you for joining us. Today we have a special episode where we're going to kind of switch things up a little bit. I have two very special guests, former interviewees from my previous episodes. I have David Banding, a faculty director at Brown for the Masters of Public Affairs program. How's it going, David?
Very good, very good.
And I also have Christian Bonce, Senior Director for North America Field Marketing and Global Events for Nexting. How's it going, Christian?
Right. I'm good. And you?
Good. Thank you guys for joining. I really appreciate it. Today, we're going to do a little bit of a switch up, and I'd like to get us to kind of start tackling some topics that I think people have been asking about, and I think things that we've kind of all experienced. So we'll go kind of little by little, talk a little about different topics, and, hopefully get some good knowledge from this. So I think to start off, one of the first things I think people keep asking is it possible to keep it real and be authentic to yourself and be successful in your career? For a lot of people, we feel like we can't be ourselves. We either have to, if you had cornrows, you might have to cut your hair to get a job. You might have to speak differently. You might have to act differently. And especially when you have little experience early on, that could hinder you. What are your thoughts on that? So, Christian, give me your some of your ideas.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. And I mean, for context, right? We all know each other for a very long time. And I'd say during that, we've all had our own respective evolutions of who we are as human beings. But just speaking to David and I, when we met in, circa 2002 or one, a long time ago at this point, you had a do-rag and I had a blowout. And that's not a form of like how I would represent myself today, but that's definitely who I was at the time. So to the question specifically, can you bring your whole self or be your whole self in these different spaces? Yes, but I think you have to think about it differently. Can you be honest to who you are as a human and what your core values are wherever you are? Yes, and you should be, because that's going to keep you happier and healthier and really engaged. Does what you wear and how you present yourself define you as who you are? I don't think that that's the case. I think that that's just where you feel comfortable right now. And I do think that in certain environments, you kind of have to conform as long as it doesn't question, again, those core values.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that with David, because I remember we had that conversation with David early on in college, where he loved wearing his do-rag. He wore his do-rag for everything, no matter what the event was or how professional it was. He wore his do-rag. And David at that time's plans were to be president. And he'd be like, I'm going to be the first president with a do-rag. And I don't ever see David with a do-rag anymore. So I think there's always I think there's an evolutionary just in yourself where it's like, I had cornrows and I baggy pants, and I don't dress anything like that just as a person, so David, you were saying something? Sorry.
I was saying, so the evolution is absolutely happening, but I think that's a part of our natural maturation, right? I have not fundamentally changed who I am, but the packaging has changed, right? And I think that's the question we're dealing with here, right? You can be your authentic self, but the packaging may change from environment to environment and from time period to time period, right? You can't put copper on a gold ring and call it a copper ring, and you can't put gold on a copper ring and call it a copper ring, right? Like the packaging is not going to fundamentally change what's inside, but it may change the way it appears to people on the outside. And so for me, at that time, I was the person who wore do-rags, and I have no regrets. This hairline is 38 is thanks to wearing do-rags and keeping my hair together. But I've matured as a person, right? So who I fundamentally am is no different than I was before, whether I'm wearing a suit or, jogging clothes or what have you. And I think that's part of what we have to understand is we navigate different spaces as we move through our lives and as we move within any point in our lives. And being able to do that successfully is a skill. It's not a burden. Some people see it as a burden. but it's an enormous skill to be able to navigate multiple spaces. I equate it with being multilingual, right? To be able to, there aren't many people who can walk in the South Bronx and walk into an Ivy League institution and feel comfortable and welcome and accepted and belong in both, right? And those of us who can, it's by virtue of a special capacity that we have. And we can choose to see it as a burden, but I've chosen to see it as a skill and as an asset.
I'd say, I think you brought up a good point, David, which was right. It's a special skill that you learn, and I can say that I have that skill. I've been walked in different environments. I'd say we all do. And I thought of the reverse, which is whenever anyone says, "Oh, I want to be able to bring my whole self to work," it's always kind of in the frame of people of color coming into white spaces. It's always put that way. Like I got to belittle myself, or I've got to bring down myself in order to fit in this space. And I almost say, how about you think about it in the other sense? When you bring your white friends to your very cultural family or environment, how do they feel? Do they go through the same things? Do they try to maybe not assimilate, but be comfortable or be aware? So you can't rock J. Crew in the hood, and you're not going to rock Polo and well, I mean, you can wear Jordans anywhere now because hip hop is everywhere. But at the time, you weren't going to come in with clothes from Dr. J's in the Bronx into an Ivy League environment because you will feel
Mm.
weird. Um, and no matter where you want to go, you want to feel comfortable because that's where you're really going to be able to be yourself. If you're constantly battling, like, is this the place for me, or have the anxiety of people looking at you weird, then you're never going to be able to open up and truly engage and benefit from the experience at hand.
But let me be clear, because I don't think necessarily you can't walk in the hood with J. Crew. I don't know that I would recommend it. Or conversely, that you shouldn't walk into, an institution of higher education with a do-rag, as I did. I did it purposely because I knew how it would resonate with other people who weren't accustomed to seeing somebody like me there. It was also, I like do-rags, right? I didn't wear caps at that time. I didn't wear, the things that my counterparts were in, and I wasn't about to adopt an entirely new persona simply for college. And I knew I didn't need to do what college was about, which is the intellectual maturation, the attending classes. All of that was perfectly possible. Whenever somebody questioned me, it gave me an opportunity to say, "Well, has my vocabulary become any less expansive with this do rag on or off?" Right? Have I lost my ability to do mathematics with my do-rag on? No. Have I lost my ability to write essays? No. And if none of that stuff that matters far more than my physical appearance is changing when I change my appearance, right? Then there should be no concerns about what I look like when I walk into the workplace. The reality, though, is that sometimes your physical appearance is more than just a physical transformation, right? It's a chemical transformation. It's right. It's like when we learned about states of matter. You have physical reactions and you have chemical reactions. Changing from a gas to a liquid to a solid is different from mixing sodium and chloride, right? You create something new in some cases when you combine things and when you mix things or when you change things in certain ways. And we have to decide, I think, which kind of reaction is happening when we're going into new spaces or we're adopting these new elements of ourselves or what have you. But I do think that it is perfectly appropriate, perfectly fine, whether you're a person of color entering a predominantly white space or vice versa, or as is the case with many women, right, having to adjust aspects of their self-presentation or their behavior in male-dominated spaces, right? And that's a privilege that we don't have to worry about as much. But we don't want necessarily people to walk into those spaces and not feel like they own it and they should be able to present themselves as they choose.
And it's different too for us when we were going to workplace compared to where it is now. Where 20 years ago when we were looking for work, it wasn't as accepting as it is now to be. I think Christian talked a little bit about it's a lot more accepting, be authentic, and be who you want to be. And you still kind of have to get that. And early on in your career, we're molding ourselves to try to get into this, put our foot in the door, so we don't stumble on ourselves to get to a job that we want. I remember when we were in college going for jobs, we were always told, make sure you shave, clean shave, cut hair, all that stuff. And now I'll be goddamn if I have to shave for. And, I mean, I look clean, but I'm not going to shave my beard to go for an interview or anything like that. And it's a you know, and I remember when you're in the middle of your career where you're have a couple little bit of experience and people are still telling you make sure to shave. It's like, nah, I got my resume. I don't need to look as good. And so I think you can get away with a little bit more as your experience speaks louder than what your, as you say, your package looks like. You know, the you can drive that hoopty with a little bomb ass engine at this point in your career because you know you're going to beat that person in the race. And I think you're able to get away with a little bit more and you're able to be more comfortable. Where before you're coming in and you're slowly introducing who you are and your culture and the bits of yourself at a career. Where that first few years, you're the first few years for Raul at one job compared to the third or fourth year, people are probably going to see Raul as a completely different person because I'm slowly introducing myself and I can be more comfortable. I can talk about things and I'm not afraid to mention things and I'm not afraid to, you know, set things off. And then as I progress, I'm a little bit more out there. Even during my interviews now, I'm interviewing completely different than I was 20 years ago, where I'm more open to being myself. I can be a little more jokester. I can be a little bit more things because I
Yeah.
have the experience to speak louder for me.
Yeah. I think about what you said, and if you think about it in the perspective, as a marketer, right, everything's advertising to me. So when you're new in a space, you are in essence an advertisement of who you are because
Mhm.
they're just seeing you; they don't actually know you. So you can control that, and it's something to think about. You get to choose how you want to present and how you want to advertise. As you progress, people get to know you; they know what you bring to the table, and all of a sudden, what they see is so much more than what's on the surface. And that's kind of where you want to get to. So don't put yourself into a situation where you don't get that opportunity. And I keep thinking of the running joke of I'm Puerto Rican, and everybody has the infamous kind of stereotype of Puerto Ricans. We put flags on everything, and we honestly do. But I'm never going to show, and I've owned one, a tie with a Puerto Rican flag on it. I'm not going to show up to an interview with a tie with a Puerto Rican flag on it because my thought is at some point, I do want you to know that I'm Puerto Rican. It is very core and important to who I am. But that's not why I showed up to this job. For you to know that I'm Puerto Rican, I want you to know that I have an ability and a skill set and a passion for what is being asked that I can do. And once I show you that I can do that, you'll learn. Oh, and you're Puerto Rican, and you happen to be Latino. Um, and I think if you can position it that way, you don't. Again, to the first core question, you don't ever lose who you are and who your core value is. You just choose the package and you choose to control the engagement that people have with you.
It's also about something else. And this is a political scientist in me offering this. It's about power, right? When you first walk into those spaces, and when you're younger, early in your career, you either don't possess it or you don't believe you possess the power to take ownership, right? Christian talked about ownership of the space, right? We didn't feel like we owned those higher education spaces or those workplaces we were entering. And so we felt at least some pressure, right? Even if we didn't actually follow through on it, to conform to the mores, the customs of that space because we didn't own it. We're in a different space now. Sometimes, in some ways, we're owners, right? Those titles that you shared with us matter, shared for us matter because it means the person coming in now, whether they're Black or white or Latino in my workplace, or they're a man or woman, they're going to see my face. And I'm going to be the model that dictates what's acceptable in the workplace. So if I'm wearing a beard, if I'm wearing my hair shaved or not, if I'm wearing a do-rag, right, that's going to dictate what they think is appropriate and acceptable in the workplace because now I have the power to shape what counts as acceptable. And I think as a result of that, we do have a responsibility to create, if we want, a new system of mores. One of the great things I think, though, about being a young person, I try to pay a lot of attention to young people, is the future always belongs to young people,
Mhm.
Yeah.
right? No matter how much anybody complains about the young people and what they're not doing and how they're not assimilating to the workplace and not acclimating to the standards, eventually the workplace is going to adapt to them, not the other way around. Because at some point, all the older people will die or retire. Maybe not in
Mhm.
that order, but something will happen. And who will be left will be the people you've just been complaining about, right? So you don't have a choice. Anybody who complained about cornrows or beards in the workplace, those people are gone. And you know who's left in their place? People with cornrows and beards
Yeah.
in the workplace. Because if your business, your job, your what have you is going to continue to exist, eventually it will be you will be replaced by people who have whatever we have right now. And the same thing goes for us. We always have to be cognizant of that. No matter what preferences we may have right now, we're on borrowed time in terms of our ability to control that, in terms of our ability to own that. And so I think power has a lot to do with this. We may own the space now, we may have power, control, and the ability to dictate what others consider normal, acceptable, professional, etc. But eventually we will have to cede that to the next generation.
And it's also, I think, important to understand the culture of the industry you're in or the career that you're in. There's some industries where you can get away with things a lot more than you can the other way. I work IT, and a lot of IT specific things are very open to do whatever you want. You can come in t-shirt and jeans and nobody's going to care. But if you're in politics, Obama's still going to get crap because he wore a tan suit.
A tan suit, yeah.
So it really you also have to be able to understand and say, okay, well, yeah, I'd love to be able to present myself this way, but certain industries you might not be that way. If a lawyer walked in wearing a basketball jersey and shorts to a court hearing with a judge, that's going to be a completely different scenario than someone coming into the IT department in the back of the building and doing what they want to do. So I think sometimes it really all depends on being able to understand and say, okay, this is the industry. What is the culture like as well, to kind of be able to get away with more.
Yeah.
And so another thing that Christian and both of y'all actually brought up is what's the language, talking differently, and that brings up another topic I want to talk about, which is code switching. And code switching is the practice of alternating between two or more languages or variety of languages in conversation. So, kind of to best explain it for a lot of people of color, you have this idea of, oh, you have to speak white at your job, which just means you're using less slang, you're trying to assimilate a little better. But I think a lot of us have that experience where we come in and we speak slightly differently, and then we go home and we speak a little bit more differently. And that's not even just with like your culture. Like I grew up in Rhode Island and Boston. I worked really hard to get rid of my my Rhode Island accent, just for job interviews, because I didn't want to come in and say, yeah, I want to get this car and I want to work here and I want to do that, because I didn't want to sound whatever. So I had to work on that. And sometimes that accent comes out here and there in real life. But, there's things where you come in and you switch it up. And would you guys like to talk a little bit about that? We can start with Christian.
I actually, that's funny. I think code switching applies to anyone. It's not, again, this is one of those things that's couched in the people of color concept, but I got a chance to see Stephen Colbert speak probably about 10 years ago. And most people don't realize Stephen Colbert is from South Carolina. He grew up with a deep South Carolina accent. And he said when he started going into the industry and went to school, he specifically worked on getting rid of that accent. And not because he was embarrassed of wherever he came from. He's very proud of that. But he knew that when people hear it, they have a certain perception of the abilities of someone who sounds like that. So again, you see him today on late night, and you would never know that is his background, but he doesn't hide it if you ask. And it goes back to how do you want to present yourself? What controls do you want to exert in order to position yourself for the best opportunity? I wish we lived in a world that didn't matter, but it does. And I could say so because I was in a parking lot yesterday and the woman before me was trying to pay for the parking and was having an issue. And I asked her, I was like, oh, did you get the credit card thing to work? And she turned around and said, nah, I got to use my debit. And I was like, wow, that was not what I expected. That is not how you appeared, but okay, we'll leave it at that. The code switching piece is very interesting because I've definitely switched up between a group of people where I feel a little bit, I wouldn't say more comfortable. I just know them in a different context. And there are words and language that are perfectly okay in that context that would not be in a different one. One, because you might not know what we're talking about. And two, because it isn't appropriate. I think there's, you should know your audience is how I look at that. And then last part of it is when I actually think of switching languages as someone who's bilingual, I do try to understand my audience even around that. I work for a European company with people speaking multiple languages, but we use English as the language of business. I've picked up enough French, I know Spanish, and depending on who I'm talking to one on one, and if it's a controlled environment, I'll use that because it's a little more comfortable or easier. But I don't try to force it on anyone. I don't set an expectation that you need to meet me there. Um, or I don't use it in a space where someone is going to feel uncomfortable. They don't know what's going on. Right. So that's where I'm looking at it from.
Yeah, I would build upon that in a couple ways. So one is code switching is not just about language, right? It's also about patterns of dress. It's also about behavior, right? And we all, as Christians said, do a little bit of that everywhere. The way many of us speak at home is not the way we speak in the workplace, nor should it be, right? And that has to do with the boundaries, the rules in your home, the customs in your home are and should be different than they are in the workplace or in a restaurant or on the plane or in a foreign country or any of those other things, right? Context matters a lot, not just for how you speak, but how you engage with people, right? When you're um, interacting with people in New York versus when you're interacting with people in New Orleans, right? People in New Orleans are much more likely to greet you on the street, strangers. So I greet people on the street in New Orleans.
Mhm.
People in New York do not greet each other on the street. People on the street in New York. And that is just, and there's a way in which there's an element of self-preservation to that. There's also a way in which you have to be conscientious, right? As Christian said, language includes and it excludes, right? So if you are doing the same thing in every environment, you're also in some ways assuming everybody's ability to do that same thing or need to do that same thing, and in some ways forcing people to adapt to you rather than, as Christian put it, meeting them halfway, right? So if you go and speak English everywhere you go, even though that's not the first language of everyone or the predominant language of the area, that implies a certain sense of superiority that is probably not appropriate, right? And so on the one hand, you might say there's something great about keeping it real no matter where you go, but it also means you might be ignoring the context around you and being insensitive to the fact that it's a different environment. But it's a tricky thing, right? And that's why I bring up this point about dressing as well, right? If you are a woman and you might in the United States not wear a head covering, if you were to travel to the Middle East for business or for vacation, should you wear a head covering? That's a tricky question, right? Because you might be being respectful of the culture, but also in some ways doing something that's very much anathema to you in your own home space, right? So we're making difficult choices when we code switch, but we're both being cognizant of the audience, right, and trying to be inclusive, but also you might be giving up a little bit of yourself when you do that. And I think that's the tension that we all wrestle with when we get involved in code switching at all. But as I said before, I think for me, I've learned to appreciate the ability to do that as a skill, right? It's a very different thing to um, code switch by choice and to be able to do it effectively because you have the ability to speak a foreign language and you understand the differences in culture in different spaces. It's another thing to do it by force, right? Because you don't know any better, or because you don't feel like you have the ability to do otherwise, or because you feel like everyone should have to conform to you.
Yeah, and one of the things too, where I think it's perception on from our culture, from the people we know, that we see it as a skill and we move on. I think early on people will see it as you're selling out. Oh, why are you speaking like that? Why do you have to speak like that? You're being a sellout, and for some people, it gets hard to accept the fact that, hey, being able to code switch is a skill. Like you said, you guys mentioned a variety of different scenarios, not just within the workforce, but a lot of people sometimes will see it and say, hey, that's not how you are. Why you speak that way? Why do you got to speak that way, and put it into a negative context? And I think we need to kind of switch it up and say, code switching is a valuable asset. We need to be able to go in there and be able to go into it, because you're not just going to be dealing with, what we normally were perceptive. And, I think we started this conversation with the general concept that a lot of people see code switching as you're speaking white, when realistically is understanding culture. You go into an environment and you're the predominantly people from Japan. You're gonna have to be able to work in there and talk and code switch and be able to meet them halfway as well. I worked with a bunch of people from the UK. It was not the same type of code switching that would occur at a job in Texas because they were completely different people. They didn't care about some of the stuff that we cared about here. Their conversations were different. They eat different bacon. You know what I mean? It was a lot of different things where I can come in there and try to meet them halfway without pushing them away. And I think that's kind of the big thing where we have to try to make sure we don't use code switching as a crutch to keep ourselves away from people. So
Yeah, I mean, I think all of it comes back to you can control what your engagement is, and the more you do so as a choice, it the more it is a skill that you learn, and it will lead to great success no matter how you do it. You brought up the points. You If you as an American go work with a primarily Japanese company, you're going to learn some of the cultural expectations of what they do if you expect to get anywhere. This is not them forcing you to conform. This is you acknowledging that these are the norms of that space. I'm going to want to know what those norms are. Same way, whether you're religious or not, you walk into a church or a place of worship, you should respect the norms of that space. You shouldn't say, like, the classic American trope, I'm American and I'm here and you got to do what I do because we control the world. That is just a bad way to think about it. Um, and no matter where you are, the more you can spend the time to understand the culture, the context, the history of where things are coming from, the better suited you are going to be towards success.
Truth is, power matters here, privilege matters here, and all of those things do dictate who has to code switch and to what degree, and the extent to which it's appropriate to do that. The reality is that the privilege of being a native English speaker is that you can go many places and speak English, particularly in a business setting, and no one's going to think that odd, right? That is not a privilege that people who are native Spanish speakers or native speakers of many indigenous languages enjoy. And so there is a privilege. There's also a privilege that we possess as men, right? If we walk into some environments where women are prevalent, we don't necessarily have to, we may not have to change in comparable ways to the way that they have to change when they enter male dominated spaces, right? I don't find myself, I don't know, changing the way I dress if I walk into a woman's dominated workplace, right? Whereas many of them may very well feel that. Or if I'm thinking about LGBTQ folks, right? Like they're going to LGBTQ plus folks, right? They're going to walk into spaces and have to change what they talk about in some places, excuse me. It's what they talk about, how they present themselves, right? How they speak as well in ways that those of us who don't identify as members of those communities don't have to or don't, right? And I think that those power differentials and the privileges that are associated with them also matter for the extent to which code switching um, is at least regarded as this asset, this skill, this opportunity where we get to make a choice that shapes our success, or this compulsion, this burden, this um, challenge that we have to confront because of our relative disempowerment.
yeah, and I think we kind of keep going back to the whole concept of assimilating. That everything we do is there's always some part of assimilation. As an immigrant coming into this country, I get assimilated to the American culture. When you go into a new job, when you go into a new school, and I think something that keeps popping up during a lot of my interviews is starting college for the first time. It's a completely different culture shock, and assimilating outside of your comfort zone, can be difficult for a lot of people, and not being able to push away from it. An example for me is really early on when leaving high school. Everything was hip hop. It was hip hop R&B. That's all you did. If you even listened to rock, everybody would shit on you for a while. Like, oh, you weren't listening to listen. Fast forward, 15 years later, and me and all my buddies are playing rock band for hours on classic rock, doing all this stuff. And now, even in the workforce, when I go and I meet people who like classic rock, I'm able to talk to them and relate and build a different relationship based off of different things that I would have never had been able to when I was younger. Because to me, it was a different culture. So I wasn't. It was a different thing that I'm used to, and I didn't want to assimilate. But once I opened myself up to being able to assimilate, and it's kind of hard sometimes when it's outside of your comfort zone to be able to do that.
So I would be wary of using the word assimilation in this case, and I would switch it to growth and learning. Right? You are, and again, growing from the same
Mhm.
environment of hip hop ruled everything about New York City in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up. And as I got older and I talked to people from that era and from that time, And you mentioned like, yeah, I grew up on Nas and Biggie and Nirvana because the Nevermind album was amazing. I would have never said that at the time, but now, and they're like, oh yeah, I love that track. Smells like Teen Spirit. I used to play that on tape.
Mhm.
That I think a lot of people had very similar experiences. But to the point you made, it's just a willingness and an openness to want to learn. That doesn't mean that you're going to assimilate and forget who you are. It's just saying I am picking up so much more than who I was at that point in time. And if we go back to the beginning of the conversation, it is this maturity, maturization, evolving of you as a human being and you as a person that I think you should think of it as, right? The where you were in 99, in 2009, in 2019 are likely different. You know, almost should be different. And if you are just doing the same thing year in and year out, to quote that grand philosopher Cat Williams, right? If you're doing the same thing this year that you were doing last year, let's not hang out because I'm trying to progress and move forward. A lot of people from the environments in which we come from, when they hear you start to sound different, engage differently, dress differently, there's a lot of that, oh, you're selling out. And to me, that's more of you're starting to have to look at a mirror and say, well, why are you able to progress forward and I'm not? And I don't like that feeling. So my response to you is you're selling out. So I can deflect the feeling of, oh, maybe I haven't done something. And I can't control for that. I just know where I want to go and what I want to do.
I mean, it's groupthink, right? With communities like conformity, right? We like having everybody be as similar as possible, right? I promise you, there's a white guy out there, or two or three, who grew up in a very different, who grew up in a certain kind of environment and was the kid who, when everybody else was listening to Nirvana or Red Hot Chili Peppers, was listening to Run DMC and other folks, and was probably being teased and ostracized for it, right? We didn't know that person because of racial segregation, and we weren't interacting with that person. But there was some of that coming on, and ultimately, it's the person who's being a little bit different from the norm, from the standard in your very parochial, small, isolated, often because this is America, racially segregated community, and you're the person standing out and being different. I don't think there's anything inherently uh, more conformist about, black and brown communities than white communities, right? The kids that we were, or for that matter, any other kind of environment. We're talking a lot about race, but again, gender is important here. Sexual orientation, all of those sorts of things matter, and there are ways that people are forced to conform or assimilate, if you will, based on all of those identities as well. But I echo Christian's point that there's a way in which, if society is operating correctly, there is an exchange of these cultural mores and norms, right? If we're able to actually retain these isolated, rigid senses of ourselves, there's something fundamentally wrong. That means we're probably not getting the exposure that accompanies growth. We're not getting that discomfort that allows us to see ourselves and the world around us a little bit differently and to change. Right. And when you start seeing people who are proudly, I've been the same person I've always been, I'm like, you should really seriously consider that. I'm not sure you should be proud of that. Right. I've been the same since day one. No, money should change you. Education. If you're still doing the same thing, I'm not saying you have to be a bad person. I'm not saying your character should change, but if you're thinking, if your philosophies, if your behavior is exactly the same as it was even 10, 15 years ago, there's something fundamentally wrong with the way you've lived your life. Um, but I do think that goes both ways. I think that there are lots of people who I encourage them to, whether you grew up poor in a predominantly Black or Latino or whatever neighborhood, or you grew up wealthy and what have you, you were probably sheltered from things on the other side. And it's everybody's responsibility, particularly if your sheltering, I think, happened to include a lot more privilege, but it's everybody's responsibility to open themselves up to those other parts of the world, the reality that exists beyond the space that you happen to inhabit.
You bring a good point with the, I mean, both of y'all bring good points with the maturity thing, where it's like, at this point in my life, I don't care what people think about me for me to like what I like. I'm going to, I didn't grow up playing golf, and I want to learn to play golf. You know what I mean? Because that's just what a lot of people do, and I never learned it. 20 years ago, I'd be afraid to say, yo, can someone show me how to golf? You know what I mean? And there's stuff that I wish I could have done. Like, I've never gone skiing. I'm an immigrant from South America. We don't ski in Peru. We stay out in the sun and we go to the beach. It's a completely different culture. But I wish I could do that. And I'm at that point in my life. you can, I think when you're earlier on, like you said, the group think's a lot stronger because that's all your experience. As you start experiencing a little bit more, you're more open to some of the stuff and you're more willing to learn. You're more willing to accept the changes and these different cultures as not being negative, but it's all positive. I love being able to go to different places and fit in just fine. I think that's a big, especially when I go for work. I think one of my biggest strengths as a when I go for job interviews is that I can I can um, join almost any culture and fit in really quickly. There's no and a lot of for success in careers, people don't want someone that's going to come in and be outcast themselves from the rest of the team because they're not willing to uh, be part of what the culture is at that team and not being able to work. And not to say that they can't change that culture a little bit, but we need to be able to be flexible enough to mend in there, go in there, and be successful with everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another thing that I think we talk a little bit about when we start talking about assimilating and being part of a different culture within it is battling stereotypes. I think throughout our lives we'll deal with different stereotypes, whether it's in school, in life, or in workplace, especially depending on where you live. Texas for me was a completely different lifestyle when it came to stereotyping based to what I had to deal with up north, where if I went to anywhere up north, everybody would think I'm either Puerto Rican or Dominican. And then when I went to Texas, everybody thought I was Mexican. I remember one of my jobs I worked at, they came up to me and said, "Hey, do you want to help us participate and set up for the Cinco de Mayo celebration?" And I'm like, "I'm not Mexican, but I love Mexican food, so I'm more than happy to help." I didn't want to be that.
Also, they're not doing that in Mexico either.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well,
Side
and
note.
it's funny because I started, my big thing for that celebration was I am going to send an email out for Cinco de Mayo to explain what Cinco de Mayo is, so people don't think it's just the Independence Day for Mexico. And so every year I was the one sending out that email saying, "Oh, it's Cinco de Mayo," which is not Mexican Independence Day. and but I participated and I helped out. I didn't want to be that guy that was shitting on people trying to do something nice and exciting. And obviously, Texas is a very Mexican forward culture, and I could understand why they confuse it. And after a while, being Peruvian is not the guess anybody's going to have when they ask me where I am. I have been Italian, Middle Eastern, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexican, and nobody's ever guessed Peruvian unless they see something I'm wearing being Peruvian. So
Look
um,
at Arlo from the block.
yeah,
You're
exactly.
already
But how do you guys?
playing all the character.
Yeah. Oh my god,
Yeah.
dude. I've and it's helped me out some places. I've gotten discounts at places because they thought I was part of that culture. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, it's okay, my friend. I'm like, all right. But how do you guys have you guys dealt with stuff like that, and how would people handle situations like that?
I think this one's dicey because you know stereotypes are funny. They come from something.
Hmm.
They're not entirely untrue in some respects. They're just broad swath assessments which clearly have issues. So I don't knock them because I understand where they come from, but I think you shouldn't use them as a way to understand people. And even as a Latino growing up in New York City, and my world was pretty much Puerto Rican, Dominican. There was an occasional Cuban, and I knew of an Ecuadorian. I didn't know there were 21 other countries of Latin America that made up people. And Queens was right across the river. Like I could see it from my house, and I still didn't know that there was so much more. I've then gone out and made it a point to learn that and understand where it is and understand the backgrounds and the food and all that. So that's a point for me to learn. In things like this, especially within the workplace, as I've gotten older and gone through my own evolution, I think the key point is like DEI. A lot of this stuff comes up as part of diversity, inclusion, or equity and inclusion efforts, and I'm almost started to kind of shy away from them because I feel like it's become this crutch of, oh, we have to do this in order to make sure that we're accounting for people, rather than letting something organically come up because the people themselves care about it. If I'm in Texas and they want to celebrate Cinco de Mayo and it's a Mexican group of people that want to share this, that's awesome. We should support it. I'm totally down to get involved.
Hmm.
If it's HR saying we're going to celebrate Cinco de Mayo as a representation of Latino culture, I'm going to say, no, I'm not about that. I'm not going to sign off on it. When we're doing Hispanic Heritage Month and you want to do something, again, as the people that are part of that group, because they choose to make it a point to educate others, all for it. Again, if it's coming from somewhere else that isn't from that, I'm not on board with it, because I and it comes from the space of, I don't think that it is my responsibility to educate you on my culture and my background and my experiences. If you want to know about it, of course I'm willing to share, but I don't need to get on a podium to say, on September 15th, let me explain to you all the benefits that we've brought into this world. Now, if I know you and we want to have a conversation, I can say, well, this is actually where this comes from. And now in the future, the same way that I engage with a lot of my French colleagues, and everybody gives them a bad rep because the French, you don't know French, they don't care about you. And yeah, they're just like, yeah, that's our thing. So we're not all like that. We just kind of hold it. It's a stereotype of ours.
Mhm.
Um,
We replace French with English, and then you have Americans. If you don't speak
yeah,
English, you don't like
exactly.
it. So
The
it's
same. It's
mhm,
just nobody likes it done to them.
mhm.
Uh, the other piece of it is, as an Afro Latino, I think there's a lot of nuance there, because I sit very comfortably in these two worlds, first as a Latino and also as a Black man. But there's a bunch of Latinos who don't look like me and are on the opposite end of the spectrum, and they feel super comfortable in more of that assimilation space where they're just like, yeah, and if you didn't know that I was X, you wouldn't know, and you wouldn't even think about it, and I use that to my benefit. Um, so it's a weird space. I don't even have great recommendations or suggestions on how you manage that, other than looking at the previous conversations we had around code switching and the skill set that's required in understanding the environment you're going to be
Oh,
Yeah.
I'll tell you right now, I will absolutely call somebody out, and quickly bow out if I'm asked to do something that I think is, first of all, inauthentic for me, but also not authentically being forwarded by the other party. I agree with Christian that, who originates an idea for something that seems to be celebrating diversity matters. I think it matters for us as we elevate ourselves into higher leadership positions to be welcoming other perspectives as well, and encouraging that kind of grassroots, bottom up acknowledgement and celebration of difference, right? Especially as, and I'm increasingly conscious of this as I get older and as I rise in my career, uh, my own privileges shape who I am, right? It's really important to me to acknowledge what it's like to be, a man and a cisgender man in workplaces where I'm going to be bringing in people who are not, right? And yeah, there's certain disadvantages that I'm going to confront as a Black person, but there are many advantages that I have, and privileges that I experience by virtue of being a man, among other things. And I think acknowledging that and creating space for other people in that way is also important. But I'll tell you, to answer your original question, I have been very fortunate that I have yet to encounter a workplace. I can't say an educational institution,
in.
but a workplace where people did not harbor those stereotypes and did not expect you to do certain things. But it's well known that in some spaces, whether it's a workplace or a university or what have you, right? The person most likely to be asked to do certain kinds of work, right? Whether it's the DEI work or what have you, is going to look a certain way, right? But that's true of gender, that's true of race, that's true of sexual orientation. There's so many other things wrapped up in that. They all need to stop, right? Because as Christian said, we have no responsibility. Even if I am literally a professor. I don't have any responsibility to educate you, however, on things about me. I do think each of us, however, has a responsibility to be educated. And I think that's part of the tension that we're all encountering, because the people who are reaching out, trying to learn, are also trying to take on that responsibility to be educated about other people's differences. What the struggle is, who do you go to and where do you get information? Well, they want to go to somebody they know, they want to go to somebody they feel is trusted, but by doing so, they're imposing upon that burden of the other person to teach without really asking them if that's a role they're willing to accept. And many of us aren't, because that's not I mean, it may be our interest, but it's probably not our job, in most cases, right? Um, but I also think it is incumbent upon me, again, especially as you get more and more power, to ask about other people's traditions, other people's experiences, and to expose myself to as much difference as possible. You talked about, Raul, earlier that we want to try to be team players and encourage team players. as I grow into more leadership roles, I'm actually trying to do the opposite. I want more and more people who grew up, who think, who behave very differently than I do, because the hope is that they will bring something to the table that I might otherwise miss. And that as a result, our team will be greater than the sum of its parts, right? We know from research that more diverse teams perform better than more homogeneous teams. And so I want to cultivate, encourage that heterogeneity as much as possible, and to foster psychological safety so that people can feel like they can bring those aspects of themselves, that they can take risks, whether it's with the way they present themselves or the way they do their jobs, or that they can even make mistakes about how they show up and how they do that work, and not feel like they're going to be ostracized or excommunicated or what have you, or punished in some other way for being different or thinking differently, or doing something a little bit different.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I did want to add too is when we talked about stereotyping is the people asking me to join the Mexican Cinco de Mayo celebration was not white people. It was other Mexicans that I worked with, and we were like, "Hey, would you like to join it?" You know what I mean? And so I think Christian and you both put in a good point where it's like if it's an organic type of event in a situation where it's like the Mexicans in the office are creating an event and they want to involve other Latinos, regardless of whether or not they're Mexican or not. And I was Peruvian and I won the salsa contest. So, like I kicked ass on it. And it's just, it's, I accept that and appreciate that. And I'll handle that completely different than if it was a corporate, like you said, a corporate sponsored event. Like I hate uh, corporatized inclusion. Yeah, I hate corporatized. I hate when you have a corporation and they're doing, oh, we're doing our Cinco, our Hispanic Heritage Month celebration, and now they have Mexican colors on everything for a month. You know what I mean? That's not all of Latin America. You're missing the point. Same thing with Pride. Every company now has rainbow on everything, and it's like you also sponsor people who hate Pride. You know what I mean? It's like I hate the corporate stuff. So organics,
Everybody's welcome.
yeah, and it's not true. And we have the organic built one. Like even at that job I had, they did a Chinese New Year's celebration that organically built within the IT department, where through the years they built a dragon through old IT parts from broken computers. Uh, what's it called? Uh, old tapes, all the stuff, and built a robot, and they do the dragon dance during the Chinese New Year celebration. But it was organically built, and all even though not everybody was Chinese, there were some Vietnamese people and Laotian people and different people would participate as well. And it was a big thing for the office, and they were super proud of it. But they built that internally. It wasn't the higher up saying, "Oh, we need to do something for Chinese New Year's," and
Yeah.
you can handle that differently. You're like you said, you're more willing to be able to say, yeah, I don't mind helping out with the Mexican celebration, despite the fact that I'm not Mexican, as opposed to work saying, bro, we need you to set up the Mexican event. I was like, nah, that's not working, dude. That's not how
Yeah,
I roll.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's to the core point of being authentically included in something by a group who sees this as important for them and a representation of them versus being voluntold to do something in order to meet a checkbox of we do this stuff. And a lot of uh, a lot of the people I know that are part of the LGBTQ plus community definitely are calling that out more and more so with the corporatization of Pride. June 1, rainbows on everything. July 1, there's no more rainbows on anything. And all of the policies and practices and inclusion that they were talking about for 4 weeks immediately disappeared. And I make it a point to never want to be a part of something that's like that. And if I feel like that's the case, then I make a choice. Like, nope, that's not what I'm here for, and that's not what I'm doing.
Yeah, I will say that I think again, as I think about being a leader now, it is incumbent upon us to explicitly create space for and encourage those things to rise up from the bottom, because they won't necessarily if you don't say something, right? While you don't necessarily want your HR or your CEO saying, "All right, we are going to have Pride Month, or we are going to have Hispanic Heritage Month," if you don't identify with any of those things personally, there also needs to be an openness to that, right? And B, somebody in the leadership position who can say that authentically, right? So that's why diversity and representation actually matter. So that it really isn't just right the person at the top doing the symbolic dance. There are a couple of things that I've noted in the realm of politics that have really ruffled me in recent years. One was when President Obama apologized for slavery. And in my mind, I'm like, what are you apologizing for? Right? Who do you what do we
I think we might have just lost David.
Yeah, this was such a deep discussion
Such a
that
great point.
it overshocked the internet.
Yeah, it broke the internet. He will come back though.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Bro, you talked about Obama. The FBI cut you off.
I don't know what just happened. It's the funniest thing though, because now my internet looks like it's down just on my computer though, but not on my phone. It's the strangest thing. I'm about to restart my computer.
Yeah. Well, we can see you, so I'm guessing you're on your phone. And as Raul said, you started talking about Obama, and you could not.
Exactly. I was like, somebody don't want me to talk about that. All right, so I'm gonna switch gears. Yeah.
I think the last thing you said was, "Why are you apologizing for that?" And you were stuck there.
Oh, so it was. I was talking about the. I think we were talking about who kind of encourages the diversity or represents or is in these positions of power, right? Like it matters who is initiating the dialogue around representation, around acknowledging historically marginalized people, all of those kinds of things. I was given Obama's apology for slavery in the U.S. as an example of that, right? Here you have the first Black president apologizing for slavery, right? And wrapped up in that is not only is he a Black president, but his Black parent and ancestors are from clearly outside of the United States and very likely and East Africa at that. So very likely had nothing to do, but could be wrong with slavery, right? And so it was ironic to say the least to have him be in that position. There have been similar circumstances like that where you've had people who were having to be accountable for things. And it just rang a little bit hollow, I think, in that case because of his perspective in that. And yet it took for the president to be Black, right, for anyone in the United States to actually acknowledge the slavery, right, and anyone at that level. And so there's this challenge there where on the one hand, you want things to be coming from people in power, right? Because you want the people in power to be willing to and able to acknowledge the responsibility to represent and include others and to encourage that kind of inclusion and acknowledgement. On the other hand, it matters whether the person doing it is able to do it from a place of authenticity. So you have to be able to combine the place of power with the person who can speak authentically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Christian.
I was going to say, no, as I thought about your responses and just kind of the conversation we've had up to this point, the thing that keeps coming back to me is as we grow in our own careers and move into more and more senior positions of authority and power, where we get to control, right, as you said, what is the example that someone sees? What are the topics that get presented? What are the opportunities that people have? And what are the traditions that don't get continued because they weren't great when we went through them? That doesn't mean that you still have to do them. I think that represents our biggest responsibility, right? If you want to see the change, be the change, not to just play on old tropes, but you have to do that. And you have to be the person who's willing to say, I'm going to plant a tree that I may never sit under, but I know that it is going to create an environment for others that was much better than the environment that I got to when I first went there. And all of these things, every skill that we have, every ability that we've learned to do and use, to me, is really in the service of that over the long term.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add one more thing too, is that force diversity part where it also acts like a double-edged sword. I don't like the concept of how pride gets handled corporatizing it, but I have a daughter who can look at all the rainbow flags and tell me what the representation is because it's so prevalent now. So, it's we talked about the younger self being the future, the younger generation being the future, and it's the same thing that you're saying, Christian. Yeah, it might be a little frustrating as someone who has to experience things differently, but the seeds are being planted for that tree that I'm not going to grow in. All this force diversity and force stuff that the corporates are doing now that feels a little inauthentic to me is teaching my younger generation stuff that we weren't as accepting with when I was her age. We didn't know
Right.
any of this stuff. So I think it can be a double-edged sword with that.
Yeah. And although I just want to offer a slightly different way of framing it, though, it's not forced diversity, right? It's the homogeneity was what was forced. Whiteness was forced, right? Heteronormativity was forced, right? Male domination, paternalism, patriarchy, those were forced, right? We didn't have to live in a world where particular people dominated and were seen as superior. We did live in a world because someone and some groups made choices that allowed that to happen. The reality has always been that people who didn't fit the prevailing culture existed, right? So whether it was people of color in a predominantly white society, whether it was women in a male-dominated society or male-dominated field or fields dominated by men, whether it was LGBTQ plus people in a heteronormative, a heterosexist world, right? There have always been people who existed outside of those boundaries, and the ones that we created that were dominant were created by us. They were constructs. We chose to perpetuate them, and by we I mean the people who enjoyed those privileges and benefited from that status quo. They chose them. They chose to perpetuate them. And all we're doing now, and all the other people who are doing who have been historically disempowered and marginalized, all they're doing is saying, let's take that away and see what happens when the world actually really is open up to all the people that exist within it and have always existed within it. Right. And so to your point, Raul, when our children, when my daughter, your daughter, Christian's daughters are seeing people referred to in a certain way, when they're seeing people being reflected in the books that they're reading, those people have already existed. It's just that now we allowed the books to be printed. We allowed the books to be into the school, except Florida. But we allowed the people to be known and spoken about and addressed and included and treated fairly and equally and respectfully, again with lots of exceptions around the country and the world. But it's only because we've made a choice to open up this very narrowly contrived world to what it really was and has always been, which is something fuller and much richer than we chose to focus on.
And this episode is proudly sponsored by being banned in some libraries throughout the country. So.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate you guys taking the time. This is some new content I'm definitely excited to be able to present to everybody, and I hope we have more experience in the future. So thank you, David. Thank you, Christian. And to everyone else, thanks again for joining in. And I hope you'll join us again next time as we continue to learn how to say success in Spanglish.